ashes of the forgotten. I took the night shift at Blackwood Crematorium because it paid well, and I needed the money. The job was simple: process paperwork, operate the furnace, and make sure everything ran smoothly. It was an old building, tucked away at the edge of town, surrounded by thick woods and endless silence. I'd heard the stories about it before I took the job. Whispers of strange occurrences, shadows that moved when no one was around, and voices heard in the hum of the furnace. But I wasn't the superstitious type, or at least I wasn't back then. It was just another quiet night when everything changed. The cremation list for the night had one entry: Eleanor Graves, an unclaimed body from the local hospital. No family, no friends, just a name on a toe tag. It felt off. Most unclaimed bodies were older, homeless, or estranged from their families. But Eleanor had been young, maybe mid-30s, with long auburn hair that still looked vibrant even in death. I wheeled her body down the long hallway to the incineration chamber, the overhead lights flickering as I passed. They always did that, and I chalked it up to bad wiring, but tonight, something felt wrong. As I reached the furnace, a cold draft swept through the room, making me shiver. I checked the thermostat. It read a normal 72 degrees, but the chill in the air told a different story. Ignoring it, I opened the chamber, the mechanical groan of the heavy iron door filling the space. The flames inside roared to life, licking hungrily at the air. I glanced down at Eleanor's face before pushing her inside. Her eyes were closed, lips slightly parted. I hated looking at them too long. There was always something unsettling about how still they were. I pressed the ignition switch, and the flames swallowed her whole. And that's when I heard it. A whisper. At first, I thought it was the crackling of the fire, but then I heard it again. A low murmur, like someone was speaking just beyond my field of vision. I turned around sharply, scanning the room. "Hello," I called out. Silence. Just the hum of the furnace and my own ragged breathing. Shaking it off, I turned back to the controls. The cremation timer ticked down slowly. I leaned against the wall, rubbing my arms, trying to warm up. Then the whispering came back, but this time it was louder. "You shouldn't have burned me." My stomach twisted. I spun toward the furnace window, peering inside. Eleanor's body should have been consumed by now, reduced to ash, but she was still there, and she was staring at me, her eyes wide open and locked onto mine through the small glass window. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over the cart behind me. My heart hammered in my chest. This had to be my imagination. I was overtired, seeing things. I wiped the sweat off my brow and looked again. The flames were raging, but Eleanor's face was untouched, her lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. And then she moved. I scrambled to shut off the furnace, my hands fumbling over the controls, but they weren't responding. The temperature gauge shot past its limit, and the whole room shook with a deep, guttural groan. The lights flickered wildly, and the shadows in the room seemed to pulse and shift. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of burning hair and something worse, something rotten. And then I heard my name, Daniel, a whisper, soft, sinister. I bolted for the door, but it slammed shut in my face. I yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I pounded against the metal, screaming, but my voice was drowned out by the deafening roar of the furnace. Turning around, I saw it. Eleanor's body, no longer inside the furnace, but standing right behind me. Her skin, blackened and charred, cracked like old parchment. Her lips, still curled in that horrible grin. And her eyes, they were hollow, endless pits of blackness that seemed to pull me in. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She stepped closer, and with each step, the shadows around us twisted, whispering her name over and over. "Eleanor, Eleanor, Eleanor." She reached out, her burned fingers brushing against my arm, and a searing pain shot through me. I screamed as my skin blistered under her touch, but she didn't stop. "You shouldn't have burned me," she whispered again, her voice crawling under my skin like insects. I fell to the floor, gasping for breath. The temperature in the room dropped even further, my breath coming out in white puffs. The furnace rumbled behind me, belching out black smoke that coiled around Eleanor like it belonged to her. I closed my eyes, praying it was a nightmare, that I'd wake up in my bed at home, safe. Then silence. When I opened my eyes, Eleanor was gone. The furnace was back to normal, and the door behind me creaked open. I scrambled out of the room without looking back, sprinting down the hall and out into the freezing night air. I quit the next morning. I didn't tell my boss what happened. How could I? I sound insane. But something followed me home. At night, I hear whispers through the vents. Sometimes, when I pass by the bathroom mirror, I catch glimpses of something behind me. Charred fingers, blackened skin. And every time I close my eyes, I see her face, smiling, waiting. The crematorium's secret. I never wanted this job. Working the night shift at Ridgeway Crematorium was supposed to be temporary, just something to pay the bills until I found something better. But life has a way of trapping you in places you never intended to stay. Ridgeway sat on the outskirts of town, a relic from the early 1900s. The place had a strange history, and locals told stories about people who were cremated there but were never truly gone. I laughed it off at first. After all, I didn't believe in ghosts. But after what happened last night, I know one thing for sure. Some things aren't meant to be burned. My shift started as usual. The hum of the furnace filled the silent halls, and the only other person on duty, Mark, was finishing up paperwork in the office. We had one body scheduled for cremation, an older man named Harold Graves. No family claimed him, so the county took care of it. Mark handed me the paperwork and stretched with a yawn. "You got this one?" "Yeah, I got it," I replied, relieved to be alone. The body lay covered on a stretcher, tagged and ready. There was nothing unusual about him, except the way his face seemed frozen in terror, his mouth slightly open as if caught in a silent scream. I rolled him toward the furnace, the corridor stretching out in front of me in eerie silence. The cremation chamber was my least favorite part of the job. The furnace, an old industrial thing with thick iron doors, always seemed too eager, like it was waiting. With a deep breath, I pulled back the sheet. Harold's face looked even more disturbed in the dim light. I forced down the chill crawling up my spine and pushed him inside. The furnace roared to life as flames engulfed the body, and for a moment, I let out a relieved sigh. Then I heard it, faint whisper. I spun around. The room was empty, but the sound persisted, like dry paper rustling in the air. I stepped back to the furnace, staring through the small glass window. The body should have been ash by now, but something was wrong. The flames weren't touching him. Harold's body lay inside the inferno, untouched by fire. His eyes were open now, wide and staring right at me. My knees nearly buckled. I scrambled for the controls, trying to increase the heat, but the dials spun uselessly in my grip. Panic set in as the furnace rattled, metal groaning and shifting under some unseen pressure. Then, in the deepest corner of the furnace, something moved. A shape, dark and writhing, began to rise behind Harold's body. Its limbs twisted unnaturally, and I could swear I heard a low, guttural chuckle. The air around me grew thick, heavy with the stench of burning flesh that shouldn't have been there. The whispering turned to voices. "You shouldn't have burned me." I stumbled back, my heart slamming against my ribs. Mark's voice crackled over the intercom. "Hey, everything okay down there?" I heard a noise. I think something's wrong with the furnace," I gasped, my voice barely steady. "I'm coming down." I couldn't take my eyes off the furnace window. Harold's face shifted, his mouth slowly stretching into an unnatural grin. His blackened lips curled back, revealing teeth that seemed far too white. Then, the furnace door creaked. It opened on its own. I didn't wait to see what came next. I bolted out of the room and down the hall, my shoes echoing against the cold tile. Mark met me halfway, his face a mask of confusion. "What the hell is going on?" he asked. I grabbed his arm, dragging him back toward the office. "There's something in the furnace, Mark. Something wrong." We reached the office, slamming the door shut behind us. Mark locked it, eyes wide with disbelief. "You're freaking me out. Man, he muttered, peering through the blinds. Before I could respond, the lights flickered. The whispering returned, louder now, voices overlapping. Angry, pleading, laughing. And then the pounding started. The sound of something heavy slamming against the crematorium doors. Mark grabbed the phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed security. But the line crackled with static, then, "You can't leave." We both froze. A deep, rasping voice drifted through the speakers, thick with something unnatural. I backed away from the desk as the temperature in the room plummeted, frost creeping along the edges of the window. Then the pounding stopped. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I glanced at Mark, his face pale. We have to get out of here," I whispered. He nodded, but before we could move, the door handle rattled. My breath caught in my throat as the door swung open, by itself. There was nothing there. Nothing but darkness pressing in from the hallway. "We run," Mark said, grabbing my arm. We sprinted through the crematorium, weaving through the long, narrow corridors. The shadows seemed to stretch toward us, and I swore I could hear Harold's whispering voice in the walls. We reached the exit, shoving against the heavy door. It groaned, refusing to budge. I pounded on it desperately. Then, a sharp click. The door swung open, and we stumbled outside into the freezing night air. The building loomed behind us, its dark windows like empty eyes watching us leave. The next morning, I quit. I didn't even go back for my things. Mark told me later that when they checked the furnace room, there was no trace of Harold's body, just ashes. But I know what I saw, and sometimes late at night I still hear it. That whisper, "You shouldn't have burned me." The ashes beneath. Working the night shift at the Hawthorne Crematorium was never something I imagined myself doing. But life has a way of leading you down strange, dark paths when you least expect it. The pay was decent, the hours were long, and the solitude? Well, I used to like being alone. Now I dread it. Started a few months ago, little things at first. Whispers in the furnace room when I was sure I was the only one there. Shadows moving against the walls where there shouldn't have been any light. I blamed exhaustion, the weight of being surrounded by death night after night. But last night changed everything. I arrived at 11 p.m., the same as always. The crematorium sat at the edge of town, a looming brick building with thick iron doors and stained glass windows that had long since lost their luster. Inside, it smelled of antiseptic, ashes, and something else. Something sickly sweet that I couldn't place. My shift started with the usual routine. Check the logs, prep the bodies, ensure the furnace was running smoothly. It was the last part that I always hated the most. The furnace room was a narrow space lined with blackened walls and the heavy iron door of the incinerator at the far end. The thing was ancient, humming with a low, hungry vibration that I could feel deep in my bones. Tonight, there was only one entry, an unclaimed body from the local hospital. No name, no history, just a tag marked D.12. I wheeled the stretcher in, staring down at the pale figure beneath the plastic sheet. I should have ignored the feeling, the sensation that something was off, but I didn't. I pulled back the plastic and immediately regretted it. The man, or what used to be a man, was unlike anything I'd ever seen. His skin was darkened, shriveled like old parchment, yet somehow it looked fresh. His mouth was open, twisted in an expression of agony, and his hands were charred black, as if he had been burned before he even got here. A shiver ran down my spine. I quickly covered him back up, chalking it up to a weird case of post-mortem burns, and rolled him to the furnace. The room felt colder than usual, the air thick with something I couldn't quite describe. I pushed the stretcher into place, pulled the lever, and the body slid into the flames. The furnace roared to life, crackling and spitting embers. I turned to leave, but then I heard it, a voice. At first, I thought it was just the wind in the vents, but it grew louder, a low, wet whisper. "You shouldn't have done that." I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the stretcher, so hard my knuckles turned white. Slowly, I turned back to the furnace. The flames twisted unnaturally, writhing like living things against the glass window. And in the center of the fire, I saw him, the man, his face staring out at me, eyes wide open, mouth moving silently. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. I must have been seeing things. But then the fire exploded, sending a wave of heat that knocked me to the floor. The room plunged into darkness, and for a moment, all I could hear was the crackling of flames and my own ragged breathing. Then, the whispering returned. "You burned me once. You can't burn me again." I scrambled to my feet, fumbling for the flashlight on my belt. The beam cut through the darkness, but the shadows seemed to move, crawling along the walls like something alive. The furnace door. It was open. No, that was impossible. The locks were automatic. Should have been sealed. With trembling hands, I stepped closer, peering inside. The fire had died down, revealing nothing but ashes. No body, no trace of the man. But then I saw it, a handprint, pressed against the inside of the door, blackened, charred, and fresh. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. And then I heard it, the scraping sound, coming from the hallway outside. I turned off the flashlight, holding my breath as I pressed myself against the wall. The sound grew louder, a slow, dragging noise, punctuated by uneven, wet footsteps. I peeked through the narrow window of the furnace room door. Something was standing in the hallway, a shape, tall, impossibly thin. Its skin stretched and blackened, moving jerkily as if every step was painful. And its eyes, those hollow, glowing pits fixed directly on the door. My breath caught in my throat as the figure raised one charred hand and pressed it against the glass. I bolted. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away. My feet pounded down the corridor, the emergency lights flickering overhead. I could hear it following, its footsteps heavy and relentless. I reached the front doors, yanking at them desperately. They wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding them shut. The whispers were all around me now. "You can't leave." "Not yet." Then the smell hit me. Smoke, burning flesh, filled my lungs, making me gag. And behind me, the sound of something wet, something breathing. I turned slowly. He was there, the burned man, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off of him. His lips curled into a charred, cracked grin. "I told you," he rasped, reaching out. I screamed. I don't remember what happened next. I woke up outside, lying in the snow, staring up at the blinking red lights of fire trucks and paramedics. They told me the crematorium caught fire. An electrical fault, they said. They found me unconscious in the parking lot. I didn't tell them the truth. They wouldn't believe me anyway. But I know what I saw, and I know that when I close my eyes at night, I still hear the whispers. "You burned me once. You can't burn me again." And the worst part? The handprint. I saw it this morning, on my bedroom mirror. Ashes to ashes. Working the night shift at Grayson Hill Crematorium was supposed to be an easy job. Quiet, solitary, and nothing more than routine paperwork and occasional maintenance. At least that's what I thought when I signed up for it. But what happened on my last shift there, I don't think I'll ever be the same again. The crematorium sat on the edge of town, surrounded by an overgrown cemetery and a dense forest that stretched for miles. It was an old building, built in the early 1900s, with creaking floors and dim, flickering lights that never quite illuminated the hallways properly. I worked alone most nights, save for occasional calls from the funeral home about upcoming deliveries. My job was simple: log the bodies, monitor the furnace, and ensure everything was cleaned up for the next day. No big deal, until that night. Started around midnight. I had just finished logging the latest entry. An unclaimed body found in the river, no ID, no next of kin. Just another John Doe. I wheeled the body into the prep room and was about to head back to my desk when I heard it. A whisper. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It came from the direction of the furnace room. The rational part of my brain said it was just the pipes, maybe the wind whistling through the vents. But it didn't sound like that. sounded like a voice. I grabbed the flashlight and walked down the narrow hallway leading to the furnace. The smell of burning filled my nose. Charred bone and ash, a scent I had gotten used to over the months. As I stepped inside, the furnace was roaring, flames flickering behind the heavy steel door. But something was wrong. The air felt heavier, thicker. I swear I heard a low, wet breathing coming from somewhere in the shadows. I shined my flashlight across the room, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing. Just the old brick walls, the rows of urns, and the cold metal tables. Then I heard it again. A soft whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Help me!" I nearly dropped the flashlight. It was coming from inside the furnace. I staggered back, my mind racing. I told myself it was impossible. Maybe a stray radio signal, maybe the heat playing tricks on me. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A handprint. A blackened, soot-covered handprint on the furnace door. And it wasn't there before. I didn't know what to do. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle. But before I could touch it, the furnace door rattled violently, shaking against its hinges. I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I rushed back to my desk, hands shaking as I dialed my supervisor's number. The line crackled, and then silence, dead silence, not even a dial tone. The whisper came again, but this time it was right behind me. I spun around, and for a split second, I saw something dark, hunched, and smoldering with ember-like eyes staring at me from the corner of the room. Then it was gone. I should have left right then and there, but my legs wouldn't move. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed the old building phone, hoping it still worked. As I lifted the receiver, a faint voice crackled through the line. "Burn with me." I slammed it down. The temperature in the room had dropped. My breath came out in white puffs, and the lights overhead flickered wildly. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the floor. I heard footsteps echoing down the hall. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I had to get out. I ran down the corridor toward the exit, but when I reached the door, it wouldn't budge. The lock was ice cold to the touch, frozen solid. I banged on it, screaming, but the only answer I got was that horrible whisper. "Closer now. You can't leave." I turned around, and the corridor was different. The walls were charred black, ash falling like snow from the ceiling, and standing in the middle of it was a figure. It was burnt beyond recognition, its skin charred and peeling, eyes hollow but burning with hatred. It reached out a skeletal hand, blackened fingers curling toward me. I stumbled back, tripping over my feet, and crawled into the nearest room, the prep room. I slammed the door shut, pressing my back against it, chest heaving. Through the small window, I could see the figure outside. It didn't move, just stood there, waiting. And then, the body on the table, the John Doe sat up. His head turned slowly toward me, and his mouth opened impossibly wide. Ash poured out, filling the air, suffocating me. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was outside, lying in the snow, gasping for air. The fire department had arrived, and the crematorium was engulfed in flames. They said it was an electrical fire, but I knew the truth. Something in that place wasn't meant to be burned. And now it's out. I still see it sometimes, in reflections in the corner of my eye. And at night I hear the whispers. "Burn with me." I don't think it'll ever stop.